war would witness not only armies pitted against armies, it would be a war in which civilians were deliberately targeted as well. A war in which civilian populations and non military targets were subjected to wholesale destruction and devastation. And over the past few weeks, we've seen how those policies unfolded on the ground, both in Poland and in the Soviet Union. The atrocities committed by the Germans against the local populations were committed against men, women, and children whom Nazi propaganda had already dehumanized, had already demonized as racial others, as Untermenschen, inferior beings, who must, by genetic, biological right, yield their place and position to the superior German Aryan race. And armed with this kind of racial thinking, the Nazi state declared war against the Jews of Europe as well. And I think it's important to think about that phrase, or the Nazis declared war on the Jews of Europe, because we can't disassociate the events of the Holocaust, the aims of its architects, from the broader narrative of the war itself, and in particular the nature of the war on the Eastern Front. These were not seen as competing goals by the Germans. In other words, we're not fighting the war on the Eastern Front and, on the other hand, engaging in the process of ethnic cleansing, of genocide. These were seen as part and parcel of a larger project. They were seen as intricately and inextricably interwoven. That's a point that comes out in both of the films for this week, whether you choose to watch Conspiracy or Die Wannsee-Konferenz, the German film on YouTube. Either one makes that point, I think, quite clearly. So we can't separate, we can't just sort of lift the Holocaust out of its historical context and think about it on its own. We have to sort of think about it in the context of the war itself. And it was a war. To give you some sense of the scope of the killing, 63% of all the Jews in Europe died during the Second World War. Out of 9.4 million Jews in Europe in 1939, 6 million were dead by 1945. In Poland alone, out of a pre-war Jewish population numbering around 3.25 million, 3 million Jews perished. 3 million out of a pre-war population of 3.25 million. In a couple weeks' time, when we read and discuss the book by Jan Gross, Neighbors, we'll talk about the thorny issues of local collaboration. But one point I want to make clear from the very beginning, that the Holocaust was, above all, the work, the vision of the Nazis. And so to understand why the Holocaust happened, we have to move our focus slightly westward, beyond Eastern Europe, where it occurred, and look to Germany, where it was devised. And I want to focus this week on the evolution of Nazi policy toward the Jews, thinking about how this policy developed from the discriminatory laws enacted by the Nazis in the 1930s to the so-called final solution, genocide, in place by 1942. When we think about how and why the Nazis' answer to the so-called Judenfrage, the Jewish question, how that evolved over time, how it evolved from a policy of discrimination and exclusion to a policy of elimination and extermination. And that's sort of a big question I want to think about this week. Now, there's no doubt that racialized anti-Semitism had always been a central point, some might say the central point of Nazi ideology. In his autobiography from the 1920s, Mein Kampf, Adolf Hitler put the matter quite clearly. He wrote, "The racial question gives us the key not only to understanding world history, but to all human culture. For in blood alone resides the strength as well as the weakness of man." Again, note the biological language that Hitler's using here. Blood, race, determines a people's strength or weakness. He goes on. The Jew is the anti-man, the creature of another god. He must have come from another root of the human race. So already in the mid 1920s, Hitler describes the racial question as not just an important issue for the Nazis, it is the central issue. As Hitler calls it, the racial question is the key to all world history and human culture. You cannot understand history and culture divorced, Hitler says, from the racial question. And it's this racialized biological dimension of Nazi anti Semitism that made it so markedly different from earlier European strains of anti Semitism. There's no, uh, put it this way, you can go far back in European history and find uh, expressions and manifestations, both written, verbal, and physical, of anti Semitism directed against the Jews of Europe. Medieval Christians, of course, had imagined Jews to be Christ killers, persecuted them on the basis of their religious difference. The Nazis, though, again, as we've seen, come out of a late 19th century tradition, a tradition steeped in the biological thinking of social Darwinism that imagines Jews as different from Germans, not by virtue of their religion or their culture. These could be adopted or altered. The Jew was different from the German by virtue of his race. Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi minister of propaganda, wrote, "You could describe the Jew as a repressed inferiority complex made flesh." Ironically, here he's using the words of the famous genius Austrian Jewish thinker Sigmund Freud, talking about the inferiority complex. Goebbels says, "You could describe the Jew as a repressed inferiority complex made flesh." This is why the best possible way to sting him, to sting the Jew, is to refer to him by his real name. Call him a wretch, rogue, liar, criminal, murderer, or killer. Beneath the surface, he will be barely affected. But look him straight in the eye, long and hard, and say, "You're a Jew, aren't you?" And you will be amazed to discover that he immediately looks insecure, embarrassed, guilty. According to Nazi thought, the Jew could not hide, right? And that's the thinking behind Goebbels' question, or his statement. Look a Jew in the eye, confront him, say, "You're a Jew," because the Jew cannot hide. Nazis saw the Jew as a permanent biological other. Jews were separate, distinct, and biologically inferior to the superior German race. And because Jewishness was not defined by religion or culture, but by biology in the Nazi imagination, Jewishness could not be overcome through assimilation. Race was indelible. What the Nazis called the biological stain of Jewishness could not be washed away. Jewishness was simply in the blood, and blood would tell. And for Nazi party members and millions more who were subjected to the indoctrination from 1933 to 1945, the Jew was believed to be forever different, separate, distinct, incapable of assimilating or absorbing into German society. This poster for a Nazi documentary film describes the Jew as der ewige Jude, the eternal Jew. And I've asked you to look at clips, a very brief clip from this propaganda film for this week. You can get a sense of how this concept of the eternal Jew was formulated and disseminated by the Nazi state. Here, another poster for the same film, Der ewige Jude. We see the eternal Jew in the service of the Soviet Union, right? The map of the USSR and the hammer and sickle, and of course the outstretched hand clutching gold. The Jew portrayed here as the agent of international communist conspiracy, images that we've seen before, like this one, the stereotypical Nazi portrayal of the caricatured Jew, immediately recognizable through the exaggerated facial features. Here, in this case, we see the Jew again, not as a communist mastermind, but here as a capitalist exploiter seated at the stock exchange, ledger in hand, atop what the poster's caption describes as the Jews' god, money, right? A huge bag of gold. Again, as I mentioned a few weeks back, I think it bears repeating. Nazi propaganda, as you can tell just from these last few images, Nazi propaganda creates and disseminates an image of the Jew that has no basis in reality. What's more, it's contradictory and doesn't parse logically, right? The Jew is depicted simultaneously as both arch communist mastermind and capitalist speculator, par excellence. Right? On the one hand, Nazi propaganda depicts the Jew as subhuman, right? as beneath the German race, and yet, on the other hand, insisting implausibly that the Jewish race is responsible for masterminding the most insidious global conspiracies and plots. So there's no logical consistency. And at the end of the day, I think the most helpful way to make sense of the cacophony of contradictory images is to simply admit that the Jew was, in the end, a blank slate, an empty vessel, one that the Nazis could fill as they pleased, as the situation required. A scapegoat onto whom they could hang blame for whatever was the ill of the day. So, Nazi policy toward the Jews would evolve over the course of the 1930s and 40s in ever more extreme and terrible ways, but the core idea is there from the very start. It's there from the 1920s in Hitler's Mein Kampf, and that itself is coming out of a decades-old tradition of extreme German nationalists imagining the Jew as an indelible other, one who cannot be assimilated. Right? The Jew is a cancer inside of German society, and the only way to prevent that cancer from infecting the healthy organism is to excise that cancer, cut it out. So the vision of a Germany made free of Jews was one that the Nazis promulgated, dreamed of. The phrase they used in German was Judenrein, right? Cleansed of Jews. The only question will be how to do this. Now, historians of the Holocaust are of two schools of thought. We can think of them as intentionalists and functionalists. And the so-called intentionalists maintain that the Nazis intended extermination of the Jews from the very beginning. And there's a series of historians, Klaus Hildebrand, Daniel Goldhagen, whom we'll be reading in a few weeks, Lucy Davidovich, whose book, The War Against the Jews, you see here on the left. The intentionalist school maintains that this genocidal solution, the extermination of the Jews, was always on the table from the very formation of the Nazi Party back in the early 1920s, and that once in power, Hitler moved to do everything in his power to carry that policy through. The other school of thought, the functionalist school, argues instead that Nazi policy toward the Jews evolved from a policy of expulsion, kicking them out of German territory, gradually to one of extermination. The final solution, eliminating the Jews of Europe, was put into effect only after the conditions of war made expulsion no longer feasible. Faced with a so-called Jewish problem that was growing worse by the addition of millions upon millions more of Polish Jews and Soviet Jews from the period 1939 to 1941, unable to cope with the logistics of mass execution by bullet, the Nazi apparatus settled on, by 1942, a final solution of systematic, mechanized annihilation. And among those scholars associated with the so-called functionalist argument is the American historian Christopher Browning, whose book Ordinary Men, one of the finest studies of the Holocaust in English, we'll be reading very soon. So one thing I want to say, it's very important to bear in mind that this functionalist argument does not in any way absolve the Nazis of guilt and complicity, not at all. The functionalists simply argue that there was a history, if you will, to the final solution, and that it's significant that the death camps began their terrible operation when they did in 1942, not 1933, when Hitler came to So the functionalists seek to trace out what Browning has called the crooked path to genocide. And I want to introduce this historiographical debate, intentionalists versus functionalists, because in a few weeks' time, when we read the Goldhagen and Browning exchange, I think it's important to have a sense of where these two schools of thought are coming from. When Hitler came to power in 1933, January of 1933, there were approximately 570,000 Jews in Germany. That's less than 1% of the German population. That's not a statistic that you hear very often. Um, Less than 1% of the German population in 1933 were Jews. And from the very start, the Nazis took measures to implement anti Jewish policies, discriminatory legislation. Hermann Goering, shown here on the right, one of Hitler's trusted deputies, head of the Luftwaffe, the Nazi Air Force, the German Air Force, head of the Prussian state police, made it quite clear that now that the Nazis are in power, violence would be a part of everyday life for Jews in Germany. In a March 11th, 1933 speech, Goering declared, "I will ruthlessly set the police to work wherever harm is being done to the German people. But I refuse to make the police into the guardians of Jewish department stores." So, from the very start, uh, Goering's remarks suggest that there will be two standards here. Right? One standard uh, for law, criminality, jurisprudence that will be applied to the German people, another standard entirely that will be applied to the 1% of German Jews. Acts of violence against Jews, encouraged by Nazi street gangs, Nazi thugs, exploded across Germany in 1933, 34, 35, and true to Goering's word, the police stood by and let it happen. In 1935, the Nazis issued the so-called Nuremberg race laws, which sought to define legally who was a Jew. According to the so-called Nuremberg race laws, the Nazi state defined Jews, again, not in religious terms, but in racial terms. For legal purposes, in the Nazi state, from 35 forward, a Jew was a man or woman, boy or girl, who had at least three Jewish grandparents. And whether that little boy or girl, man or woman, went to synagogue or not, whether that person was religiously observant or not, whether that person kept kosher, observed the high holy days, whether the person was completely assimilated into German culture and society or not, didn't matter. What mattered was race. The Nuremberg race laws also deprived Jews of their German citizenship. And this was an important point. No longer citizens of the Reich, Jews were now, after 35, legally reclassified as subjects of the Reich. And that distinction stripped German Jews of their civil and political rights. One of the participants at the Wannsee Conference in 1942 was the Nazi jurist who devised the Nuremberg laws. He's played by Colin Firth in the film Conspiracy. You get a sense of um, his role in creating this intricate and very, very complicated. Jews in the Reich were required by law to carry identity cards, internal passports. All ordinary Germans, quote unquote, all Germans in the Reich carried internal passports, but Jews had a large red J stamped in theirs, as you can see here. And after 1939, Jews had to wear the infamous yellow badge, the Star of David, with Jew, as you can see, written in a kind of mock Hebraic, mock Hebrew script, Yud. All of these measures, putting stamps in passports, identity badges, be they stars or armbands, all of these measures were designed so that the highly assimilated German Jewish community could now be made visible so that the enemy could be easily identified, so that the enemy could be easily targeted. And I mentioned the high assimilation, the high degree of assimilation among German Jews, a completely different story than we saw in Poland, for example. In Poland, Jews had been discriminated against since the 1930s. Jews were under the Piłsudski regime, and after, Jews were almost second class citizens, and of course, the discrimination would get far, far worse and turn into outright murder when the Germans invaded Poland. But Polish Jews were distinguished from their Christian Polish neighbors by dress, by language, by their religious conviction. By contrast, German Jews were highly assimilated. They dressed like Germans. They spoke German. They worked until 1933 in the German state bureaucracy. They taught at German universities. So these measures to make Jews visible, to highlight their presence as a way of identifying them and then uh, discriminating against them. We see this from 34, 35 forward, certainly with the Nuremberg laws of 35. Over the course of the 1930s, the Nazi regime authorized a series of discriminatory laws that were aimed at excluding Jews from public life, essentially pushing Jews beyond the margins of society and beyond the legal protection of the law. For example, the law for the restoration of the professional civil service, as it was called, barred Jews from serving as state officials or bureaucrats. They were denied employment opportunities in the state. Jewish actors, Jewish musicians, now by law could only perform for other Jews. They could not perform for Gentile audiences. New inheritance laws were introduced, making it impossible for Jews to own land, for Jews to own property. Jews were forbidden to contribute to non-Jewish newspapers, just to give you a handful of examples. And these laws against Jews in the civil service, Jews in the arts, Jews in the world of letters, reflect a reality that even though Jews had accounted for only 1% of the population, Jews had been very, very highly represented among the professional classes in Germany. A very strong showing of German Jews, again, highly assimilated German Jews for the most part, who were doctors, lawyers, musicians, artists, professors. Now, by the mid 1930s, they were prohibited by law from practicing their professions. Jewish doctors had their licenses revoked. They could not treat German patients. Jewish lawyers were disbarred. Jewish workers could be dismissed from their place of employment and replaced by Germans. In fact, there were incentives offered by the Nazi state to employers to fire Jews and hire Germans. German consumers were encouraged by the government to boycott Jewish shops. And the Nazis referred to these measures as the Aryanization of the German economy and public life. Again, reflecting this idea that the Jew has crept into all crevices of our social, economic, and cultural life. We must become Judenrein. We must be cleansed of this Jewish presence. So we must Aryanize the German economy. All sorts of public spaces, universities, schools, restaurants, cafes, hospitals, theaters, museums, even swimming pools. These public sites, civic institutions, were proclaimed off limits to Jews in the mid 1930s. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 significantly forbid marriage between Jews and Germans, as well as any sexual contact whatsoever between Jews and Germans. Again, for fear of contamination, for fear of racial pollution, as it was called. So, piece by piece, law by law, the Jews of Germany were deprived in the 1930s of their civil rights. They were transformed from citizens into pariahs, outcasts. In response to this official pressure from above and growing resentment uh, stirred up by the Nazis against the Jews, rising resentment from below, many Jews, understandably, chose to emigrate. By 1935, 25% of German Jews had left Germany. 25%. Now, why didn't more leave? This is a question that students and scholars of the Holocaust always have to grapple with. We knew in the 1930s how bad things were for the Jewish population of Germany. Why didn't more Jews leave? Well, for one, it was a difficult step. It was an extreme step to simply leave your home behind and start your life anew. In David Sirakowiak's diary, right, he talks about the difficulties, his father wrestling with the idea of moving from Łódź to Warsaw. I mean, imagine the even greater uh, difficulties of leaving your homeland behind. These German Jews thought of themselves as Germans. Leaving their home was incredibly difficult. But even those who had made that mental leap and were prepared to leave their homeland and start a new life somewhere else encountered great obstacles. By law, Jews could only take 10 Deutschmarks with them when they left the country. That's about $4. Everything else was forfeit. All the rest of their money and property was forfeit. And that's a big obstacle toward immigration. You can only leave with $4. But the greatest obstacle toward Jewish immigration was the fact that Britain and the United States imposed quotas on the number of German Jews that they would accept. The British and American consulates in Germany would only grant a limited number of visas. And to book passage on a ship for the journey overseas, you had to have your paperwork in place. So it was a complicated situation. Many German Jews wrote these sort of heartbreaking letters and diaries that have survived in which they say, went to the consulate won't give me a visa unless I have um, my boarding papers for the ship won't issue boarding papers unless I have the visa from the consulate. They found themselves in an incredibly difficult situation. So what seems a simple problem, why didn't Jews simply leave, was in fact very complicated. Leaving Germany was impossible for many and unimaginable for others. Legal restrictions that had been mounting against the Jews became outright violence on the night of November 9th, 1938. Anti-Jewish riots broke out all across Germany. More than 100 people were killed. Thousands of Jewish homes, Jewish shops, Jewish synagogues were ransacked and looted. People referred to it as Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. Kristallnacht, November 9th, 1938, marked a turning point of sorts because, despite what the Nazis claimed, this was not a localized, spontaneous act of popular violence. Nazi papers and radio broadcasts claimed that the violence on display on the night of Kristallnacht was the manifestation of righteous indignation on the part of the German people against the Jews. And also, it was portrayed in the Nazi press as direct retaliation for the assassination 2 days before of an official at the German embassy at Paris, who had been shot by a young Polish Jew whose family had been expelled from their homes uh, in Hanover, in Germany, and deported from the country. And this young man, Heinrich Greenspan, shot and killed a German official at the German embassy in Paris. So the Nazis said, well, the violence of Kristallnacht is a manifestation of popular outrage against this heinous violence perpetrated by the Jewish criminal Greenspan. In fact, the Kristallnacht violence had been orchestrated by the Nazi authorities. We know this now. It had been carefully coordinated from above to sort of test the waters, to see what they could get away with. In a memo to Hitler, Goebbels wrote, "Pull back the police. The Jews, for once, should feel the anger of the people." And so the police stood back while thousands of homes synagogues, shops, schools were looted. This is perhaps the most famous image, uh, the broken glass the day after. But here you see buildings ablaze, uh, community efforts to extinguish the flames, a synagogue on fire, and again, the famous image of broken glass. In the wake of Kristallnacht, the Nazi state levied a fine on the Jewish population of Germany totaling 1 billion marks to pay for the cleanup. And after 1938, the German state Jewish property. They took away land and business on the basis that these rightfully belonged to the state and the German people. The first mass arrests of German Jews began in the fall of 1938. By the end of that year, just a month and a half after Kristallnacht, 30,000 German Jews had been arrested and jailed at the prisons of Buchenwald, Dachau, and Sachsenhausen. The only crime that these inmates had committed, of course, is that they were Jews. As an aside, I'll mention that the British and American governments deplored the violence. FDR, the American president, the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, deplored the violence, but they did not act to open up their borders to Jews seeking to emigrate. Nor did they, excuse me, move to grant more visas. In late 1938, after Kristallnacht, this is a major turning point. In late 1938, Hitler told high-ranking Nazi officials that the Jewish question must be now, once and for all, coordinated and solved one way or another. How? Excuse me. In the late 1930s, 38, 39, Nazi leaders toyed with the idea of simply deporting all of the remaining Jews in the Reich. Some Nazis suggested we could send them to Madagascar, off the African coast, a plan which appealed to many. One Nazi newspaper suggested that if only the Americans would open up their borders, they might very comfortably house all of Germany's Jews in the vast expanses of Alaska. Some suggested that the British colony of Tanganyika, present-day Tanzania, in East Africa, could be a home for Germany's unwanted Jews. So there were plans for deportation. But when the war began in 1939, deportation, or encouraged emigration, as the Nazis put it euphemistically, now this seemed like a less viable option. The diplomatic problem of who would take Germany's Jews was difficult enough to resolve, as we've seen in peacetime. Under conditions of war, it was all but impossible. Territorial expansion brought new Jews into the German Reich. By gobbling up Austria and the Sudetenland in 1938-39, Hitler had added 300,000 more Jews to the German Reich. The invasion and occupation of Poland brought more than 2 million more. So the Nazis' relentless pursuit of Lebensraum, living space, exacerbated the so-called Jewish problem. The Judenfrage, the Jewish question, refused to go away. And as the war proceeded and Nazi armies pushed eastward, the problem got worse from the Nazi perspective. Because as you can see from this map, where do the bulk of Europe's Jews reside? In 1933, and these numbers would hold more or less throughout the decade, you have concentrated so that Jews such as the Sierkowiak family who already lived in Łódź found themselves now rubbing shoulders with Jews from the countryside and increasingly as the years went on with Jews from elsewhere in Nazi-occupied Europe. So, resettlement in the ghettos. The word ghetto is, historians suggest, of Italian origin, and it originally referred to those neighborhoods in medieval towns where Jews were required by law to make their residence. Throughout the towns and cities of medieval Europe, you could find Jewish ghettos. Up until the late 18th century, when the restrictions on Jewish mobility and Jewish residence were lifted throughout most of Western and Central Europe, a consequence of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic era. These new ghettos of Nazi-occupied Europe were very, very different from medieval ghettos. The new ghettos were fenced off. They were often sealed or walled off with bricks or cement. And needless to say, as we know from what we've read so far, the living conditions in the ghettos were appalling. By November of 1940, a year after the invasion of Poland, there were 500,000 Jews crowded into the Warsaw Ghetto alone. That's 40% of the city's population crammed into a neighborhood of 1.3 square miles. 40% of the city's population living in a ghetto that, in terms of area, comprised less than 5% of the total area of Warsaw. 40% of the population living in 5% of the city's space. In the Vilnius ghetto in Lithuania, conditions were so cramped each man, woman, and child had, on average, 2 meters of living space. In the ghetto at Łódź, the home of the Sierkowiak family, average population density was 5.8 Jews per room. Here you see a photo of the Łódź ghetto. About 1.5 square miles in area, home to 167,000 Jews in 1.5 square miles. 95% of the apartments and dwellings in the Łódź ghetto had no running water, no sewer access, no sanitation. In the Polish, now Ukrainian city of Lvov, barbed wire marked off the Jewish ghetto. And because the ghettos in Lvov, in Warsaw, in Łódź, etc., because the ghettos were self-contained, sealed off, the German officials could regulate, in principle, materials that entered, food that came in. In the Warsaw Ghetto, Jews received rations of approximately 253 calories per day. Just enough to work, barely, but so little that they would inevitably weaken and die. And in truth, the Nazis were deliberately seeking to starve the Jews to death. They were slowly succeeding. You get a sense of that from, again, the Sierkowiak diary of a few weeks ago, where every waking thought, every day's entry is consumed with the idea of acquiring food for the day and maybe food for tomorrow. The acquisition of food became the sort of predominant motivation for Jews living in the ghettos. In 1941, more than 11,000 Jews starved to death in the Warsaw Ghetto alone, men, women, and little children. Here you see Jews' received from the German occupiers. And many survivors and historians, too, have described the members of the Judenrat as Nazi collaborators. Certainly, David Sierkowiak saw the infamous Chaim Rumkowski, head of the Łódź ghetto, as a heinous criminal figure. But these men were placed in impossible situations. This is a point that I want to come back to later on. We talk more about the Judenrat. And to be fair, most tried their best to mitigate conditions under which they were forced to operate, which were brutal and horrific. So, excuse me, so the point is that the outbreak of war marked a real turning point in Nazi policy toward the Jews. Anti-Jewish policy had been discriminatory for years, but after 1939, it became much more radicalized. It moved toward a policy of isolation and extermination. As the Nazi army marched eastward, another group marched in behind them, the so-called Einsatzgruppen, or Special Forces. And these were made up primarily of SS police battalions and special reserve police units that had been sent east from Germany. The Einsatzgruppen were, in effect, mobile killing units, and their task was to follow behind the German army and arrest or eliminate civilian opposition. The Einsatzgruppen had orders to pacify the local population, and that meant arrest and kill Polish intellectuals, political leaders, cultural figures, execute Soviet POWs who were members of the Communist Party or Red Army political commissars, the infamous Commissar Order of 1941. And they had orders, too, to arrest or better execute all Jews. So the Einsatzgruppen's task, which was illegal by all international standards of military conduct in time of war, was essentially to pacify the population in occupied territory through extermination, to clean up, mop up resistance and undesirable populations as they moved behind the rapidly advancing German army. After Operation Barbarossa, 4 companies of Einsatzgruppen, each numbering between 500 and 700 men, followed the Nazi armies into Soviet territory, into Soviet-occupied Western Poland, into the Belarusian Soviet Republic, and into Ukraine. Of course, from the map that we saw, these are regions, again, that had the highest Jewish populations in Europe. In a deposition taken after the war, an Einsatzgruppe commandant described what would happen as his units advanced behind the German armies. I'll go back to this photograph. The commandant said, "We would enter a village or city and order the prominent Jewish citizens to call together all Jews for the purpose of resettlement. They were requested to hand over all their valuables to the leaders of the unit and to surrender their coats and outer clothing. The men, women, and children were then led to a place of execution, which in most cases was located next to a deeply dug anti-tank ditch. Then they were shot, kneeling or standing, the corpses thrown into the ditch." Here you see a photograph of Einsatzgruppe men, and the Jews whom they are about to execute are digging their own graves, literally, at the order of the Einsatzgruppe. Once the ditches are dug, they will be shot. To go back to this map shows you the range and scope of Einsatzgruppen activity on the Eastern Front from June of 1941 to November of 1942. Each of those dots represents a confirmed massacre site. And as the captions here on the map are just a sampling of massacre sites, not all sites can be shown or labeled. There's not space enough to represent every massacre committed by the Einsatzgruppen. The death tolls in the massacres are simply staggering. In the Polish, now Ukrainian city of Lviv, 7,000 Jews were gunned down, 14,000 in Kharkiv, 15,000 in Rovno, 28,000 in the Ukrainian city of Vinnytsia. Here, an Einsatzgruppe soldier prepares to execute the last remaining Jews in Vinnytsia. Here, a famous photograph of an Einsatzgruppe commandant executing the last Jew in Vinnytsia. Perhaps the most infamous site of Einsatzgruppe violence took place over the course of 2 days in late September of 1941. Detachments of Einsatzgruppe working in shifts gunned down more than 34,000 Jews at the ravine of Babi Yar outside the Ukrainian city of Kiev. And here you see a photo of the violence. The Jews have been shot, their bodies thrown into the ravine, and the Einsatzgruppe are going by to make sure there are no survivors. By the spring of 1943, these mobile killing units, the Einsatzgruppen, had destroyed more than 1 million Soviet Jews, men, women, and children, and tens upon tens of thousands of ethnic Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians. So from 1941 forward, with the invasion of the Soviet Union, the Nazi policy evolved from random brutality and ghettoization in Poland to organized mass murder up and down the Eastern Front. By late 1941, these tactics of extermination were being applied from the front lines to the 33 Jewish ghettos in occupied Poland. In October of 1941, the Jews of the Kovno ghetto were ordered to assemble in the city square. They complied, having no notion of what was to befall them. Once they were assembled, a Nazi officer ordered the Jews, nearly 40,000 of them, to walk slowly past, single file. And as they did, the officer and his staff motioned for some Jews to step to the left, for others to step to the right. About 10,000 of the seemingly stronger and healthier Jews were given work permits and allowed to return to their homes in the ghetto. The other 26,000, deemed weak, sick, or unfit for labor, were led outside the city limits and shot that afternoon. 26,000. In the ghettos, the members of the Judenrat, the Jewish councils, found themselves forced to make horrible choices as the Nazis sought to contain the growing ghetto populations. And this concern of Nazi administrators about the growth of the ghetto, again, is a theme that comes out in either of the films for this week, either Conspiracy or Die Wannsee-Konferenz. In October of 1941, Nazi officials in Vilnius, fearful of the growth of Jews, the Jewish population in the ghetto, ordered the Judenrat to cull the population of the ghetto. Nazi officials gave the Vilnius Judenrat 3,000 yellow permit cards and told them to distribute those 3,000 permit cards among those Jews in the ghetto whose work was deemed most essential, most critical to the German war effort. And each of those 3,000 could designate 3 family members to stay with him or her. So essentially, the Nazis put the Judenrat in the awful position of determining, quite literally, which Jews would live and which would die. The Judenrat had to make terrible, painful moral choices. And so too did the families. Even if you received a permit, you could only allow 3 family members to stay with you. So larger families or multi-generational households had to make horrifying decisions. A member of the Judenrat in Vilnius who survived the war defended his participation in the selection process in these terms. He said, "When they, the Nazis, asked me for 1,000 Jews, I handed them over. For if we Jews would not give in on our own, the Germans would come and take them by force. And then they would take not 1,000, but many thousands. By giving 100, I can save 1,000. With the 1,000 that I hand over, I save 10,000. I did everything in order to save as many Jews as possible. To ensure that at least a remnant of Jews survived, I myself had to lead Jews to their death. In order that people might come out of this war with a clean conscience, I had to befoul myself and act without conscience." After the Vilnius Judenrat made its final excruciating decision, more than 10,000 Jews in the ghetto were left without permits, and they were all shot. German officers and SS commandants reported in their dispatches that the kinds of mass executions we're talking about were producing negative effects, debilitating, demoralizing effects on the psychological well being of their men. And increasingly, among Nazi planners and Nazi officials entrusted with the resolution of the so called Jewish question, increasingly conversation comes round to the idea of finding a more rational, a more efficient means to solve the Jewish question, to cleanse this newly acquired Lebensraum of its impure elements, to prepare the groundwork for a future Germanization, Aryanization of the East. And to that end, to find a more rational, a more effective means of resolving the Judenfrage, the SS deputy chief, number two man in the SS, Reinhard Heydrich, convened the Wannsee Conference in January of 1942. And it's at this point, January 1942, that Nazi Jewish policy evolved to its final and most horrific state. At the German resort town of Wannsee, just outside of Berlin, high ranking Nazi party members, military leaders, economic planners, diplomats met to discuss the Jewish problem. And here is where they met, at this stately villa, a villa that had once been owned by a prosperous German Jewish businessman, a villa that was, of course, confiscated and put at the disposal of the state. Here, in January of 42, a dozen representatives from the SS, the Foreign Ministry, and the Nazi Party met for just 90 minutes. And in that 90-minute time, they settled upon what was to become known as the final solution to the Judenfrage. And the final solution, of course, is extermination, to which we'll turn next week. I've asked you to read Mark Roseman's book about the Wannsee Conference for this week, his book entitled The Wannsee Conference and the Final Solution, A Reconsideration. Roseman's a very good historian. I think reading that book in concert with either the film Conspiracy or the German film Die Wannsee Conference, really allows us to sort of think about what this conference symbolized, what it meant, and what it meant for the next 3.5 years of Nazi policy toward the Jews. Because it's at the Wannsee Conference that the mass extermination of Jews is settled upon, is decided upon. And how that comes to be and what its effects are a theme we'll cover